Water, the basis for all life on Earth. Our cities cluster around fresh water supplies for good reasons. It not only quenches our thirst, we also rely on it for irrigation and agriculture, transportation, industry, waste management, and electricity. Further, we turn to rivers, lakes, and streams for swimming, fishing, and a psychological respite from urban life. Unfortunately, urbanization is now threatening the sustainability of this valuable resource. The past 200 years have seen a massive shift from rural to urban living throughout the world. Compare the approximately 5% of the United States population that lived in urban areas at the beginning of the 19th century to the nearly 70% living in cities and suburbs at the beginning of the 21st century. The demands on a finite urban water supply have ballooned, while the supply itself has been squeezed by the development making the demands. The history of the Puget Sound region has mirrored this national explosion in urban populations in the 20th and 21st centuries. The counties bordering Puget Sound are now home to over 4 million people, 2/3 of Washington state's population. In this region, domestic and industrial uses consume almost 500 million gallons of water every day. Moreover, land use changes favoring pavement and shingles also directly impact the hydrologic cycle, decreasing water storage while simultaneously increasing flooding in heavily populated areas. In the 10 years from 1991 to 2001, the area of the Puget Sound Basin covered by buildings, roads, and parking lots went from 3% to nearly 10.5%. This means 1,300 square miles of land, an area equal to 630,000 football fields, is no longer fully functional watershed. This increases stormwater runoff and decreases natural attenuation processes, which in turn threatens water quality. With increasing demands made on a limited supply of fresh water, the question of how tomorrow's supply can be secured is of ever more critical concern. To understand modern water management issues, we first need to understand how a watershed functions. A river's watershed is the land area a particular river drains, both above and below ground, as it is fed by rain and melting snow and glacier ice. The Puget Sound's rivers depend in part on heavy winter rains for replenishment, but even more on a reliable supply of winter snow. As raindrops fall to the ground and snow and ice melt in the mountains, trickles of water build and flow over the land's surface. Trickles become rivulets, rivulets become streams, and streams become tributaries, eventually forming rivers with names like Skagit, Nooksack, Skokomish, and Puyallup. More difficult to see, poor soils also allow water to infiltrate into the ground, forming subsurface aquifers. This groundwater is stored and steadily metered out to the region's rivers throughout the year. Thus, these aquifers, though unseen, are a vital part of the river system. The Puyallup River watershed typifies many watersheds in the Puget Sound region. This river system begins as meltwater from glaciers on Mount Rainier. The Puyallup River is then swollen by two major tributaries, the White and Carbon Rivers, as it flows to Commencement Bay in Puget Sound. The river is named for the Puyallup Tribe, whose history has been intimately shaped by the river and its salmon. The name Puyallup means the generous people who welcome all those who come to their land. Indeed, they could afford to be generous. The healthy, intact river system had provided reliably for the people living around it for at least 10,000 years. Since then, the number of people living in the Puyallup River watershed has changed radically. The river system is now being asked to sustain greater numbers, while the landscape that historically made this possible is being populated, leveled, and paved. The Puyallup River now flows past more than 800,000 inhabitants before emptying into Puget Sound. How then is this vital water resource being safeguarded for the future? This documentary looks at the complex set of water management problems affecting the health of the Puyallup River and the challenges posed not just by the science of what to do, but also the politics of how to get it done. The first problem facing the Puyallup River is one of water supply, both of too little and conversely of too much. On the one hand, both aquatic life and humans require a sufficient supply of water to survive, while on the other hand, too much water results in flooding, habitat destruction, and property loss.
Well, first of all, in Washington State, water is considered a public resource. So if a businessman, if a community, or a farmer wants to get a water right, they apply to the Washington State Department of Ecology for a water right, and then we process the application. And we do that by comparing the application to what is called a four-part test. And that is, first, is water available? Second, will the water be put to a beneficial use? And beneficial use is most reasonable uses of water. Third, is it in the public interest? And fourth, can we issue that water right without impairing somebody else's well or water right and without impairing stream flows? At the Department of Ecology, we have this dual role: allocate water for new uses, and at the same time protect existing wells, protect existing water rights and stream flows.
Well, low in-stream flows are a problem. Everybody wants to see our listed Chinook thrive, and they're one of the species that, due to their size, are actually physically limited from moving upstream in low flow conditions. Because they're early September spawners, their natural return timing coincides with pretty low flows. But if those flows diminish to such a point that they're physically unable to move upstream, then we're going to see large areas of this watershed absent of Chinook salmon.
Washington water law is grounded in 19th century water law. That is, there's a provision called first in time, first in right, that was set up to protect agricultural interests, homesteaders, and mining claims. There's also a provision called use it or lose it. Water is a public resource, and it's through a water right, it's appropriated for private use, and you can keep using that water right as long as you're putting it to a beneficial use. But as soon as you stop, it reverts back to the public. So if you conserve water, it's really the use it or lose it provision that creates a disincentive for conserving water, because heck, I conserved water, well, now my conserved water goes back to the public. What's in it for me? The way the Water Code is set up, it's set up to protect investments. So if you have a farm and you've been using water for 50 years, it's your water. But if there's a higher beneficial use, a higher economic value, like for example, what if that water was for municipal water supply? You can't really get to it. So there really isn't a mechanism to ensure that you get the highest economic use of water in the Water Code.
The Department of Ecology closed most waters in the Puyallup River Basin to new water rights allocations in 1980, meaning that the agency determined that further withdrawals would impact in-stream values. Unfortunately, Western water law is not construed to promote water conservation.
The U.S. Geological Survey, through a joint study with the Puyallup Tribe, has shown that the in-stream flows in the Puyallup watershed are continuing to diminish. So the fear is that without the necessary water resources available to fish, the fish returns will continue to diminish. It's not a stretch to make that connection at all. Water is probably the key element in their life cycle.
On the plus side, a new water supply project planned for Lake Tapps is actually improving in-stream flows in an area critical to salmon on the White River, a tributary to the Puyallup.
First of all, Lake Tapps is it was a series of ponds. In about 1905, Puget Sound Energy purchased the property and built a series of levees and berms around the lake. They developed a flume, so water came from the White River into the lake and out the hydropower project at the end of the lake, a small hydropower project. But in the process, for most of the 20th century, they dewatered about 20 miles of the White River. It had become more and more expensive to maintain the levees, to maintain the berms, the fish byways, the flumes. So they were looking for ways to raise revenue to protect the lake. In the meantime, many people had moved there, built homes, so there was lots of community interest in that too. So the idea was, why not apply for a regional water supply water right And so we got the application. We've been processing it. Hope to have it done in 2009. And there'll be probably three major benefit areas. One, it's a large regional water supply for the urbanizing areas in King County and Pierce County. Two, it will preserve the lake and all the amenities, the fisheries amenities, the recreational amenities of the lake. And three, we'll have provisions with that water right to ensure higher minimum flows in the White River, particularly during key times of the year when fish need it, during low flow periods.
In 2004, January 15th, 2004, Puget Sound Energy ceased operation of its White River hydroelectric project, a generation project that had been in operation since 1911. So we're witnessing some really profound changes take effect in what we call the bypass reach. For the first time, we're actually witnessing natural flow conditions in all that habitat. So we're anxious to see how the fish populations respond to that newly available habitat. We've got hydrologic connections, surface water connections to a variety of peripheral habitats, side channels, feeder tributaries, very densely foliated floodplain areas. So it's ideal habitat in terms of salmon production. So we're really optimistic that we're going to see a big increase in the number of fish in the next 2 and 3 years.
However, future siphoning of water from lake taps and the Puyallup River watershed to supply drinking water to the growing suburban communities outside of the watershed may contribute to dewatering the lower Puyallup River again. In the past, mandated in-stream flows have been diverted to feed power generation during years of drought, resulting in adverse effects on fish. This may occur again in the future as in-stream flows are pitted against drinking water supplies during dry years.
We've been working with some groups, including Cascade Water and Puget Sound Energy, to try to figure out what a good minimum in-stream flow would look like. And we haven't arrived at that yet, but we're definitely optimistic that it will be a much improved situation over what it's been in the past.
In the Puyallup River watershed, it is important to recognize that currently water is withdrawn primarily from groundwater wells in the river valleys, rather than directly from the river itself. But groundwater is connected intimately to surface water supplies, and outdated laws continue to allow additional groundwater withdrawals to tax in-stream flows.
When the Washington State Legislature developed the Groundwater Code in 1945, they excluded from permitting requirements certain what they considered to be minor uses of groundwater. Those uses are up to 5,000 gallons of water a day for household use or group of households, up to 5,000 gallons a day for industrial use, up to half an acre of non-commercial lawn or garden, and all stock water. So the six-pack concept is that with 5,000 gallons a day, you can pretty easily get 6 homes in without a water right. In fact, you can get sometimes 10 or 12 homes in without a water right.
Urbanization also acts to decrease the recharge of water to underground aquifers and surface waters during dry periods by preventing water from percolating into the soil. Conversely, during rain events, since water cannot penetrate barriers like concrete and roof shingles, it runs off rapidly to the river system, leading to channel scouring, erosion, and flooding.
As areas urbanize and water is simply piped quickly to Puget Sound, that's less water going into the groundwater, and there's less groundwater then to support the streams during summer. When areas urbanize, generally we see additional flows coming into the streams and the natural systems, and those, we call it becoming flashy. Rather than a nice, slow, even flow throughout the year, suddenly we'll see storms that send the creeks over their banks very rapidly, and then they recede very rapidly. And it's not a natural hydrologic function for those creeks.
Flooding is natural to any watershed, but what changes is the frequency of that occurrence and the magnitude of that occurrence. And that has a tremendous effect on the habitat viability and suitability of a watershed, and it also affects the fish populations within. Their eggs are therefore vulnerable to the scour and the erosive forces of high flow events in the streams, which is one of the primary reasons we've seen diminishing salmon populations in those urbanized or heavily developed watersheds or sub-watersheds.
The tributaries to the Puyallup River are especially impacted by urban and suburban development. Swan Creek provides a good example, with increased erosion in the lower reaches and the dewatering of wetlands and a loss of aquatic habitat in the upper reaches.
We are standing in the original meander of the Swan Creek. Swan Creek starts the headwaters at 121st approximately, just west of Waller Road. It used to have salmon all the way up to 104th, and we're at 112th. So the salmon used to come just to about that far. A lot of the water is diverted into storm lines, sewer lines. We have been dewatering our wetlands for a very long time. Their role in nature is to flood in the winter and then hold that water in their soils and then continuously release it throughout the year so that the creeks and streams have a steady supply. So if we keep going the way we are, we can pretty much write off most of the water supply from the uplands to the river.
As critical as these tributaries are to the health of the entire river system, watershed activists here feel that these areas are largely ignored in watershed management.
You know, if you pour water on pavement, it'll run off. If you pour water on grass, it soaks in, and that's the big difference. There is no pervious concrete in this project. There are no rain gardens. That's not an LID, a low impact development project. So basically by changing the surface structure, changing it from a groundwater system to a surface water system, it just, when it rains a lot, it'll move off fast. It just adds up, and so what you have is a cumulative effect. This particular pond is just, it's a microcosm of everything happening up and down the valley. This little wetlands, this little hole in the ground here, does not look like it's part of saving the salmon in Puget Sound or keeping Puget Sound alive, but really it is. The way the regulations are built, and when they were written back in the 70s, they were not looking at a watershed watershed as an entity, as a whole, as a living organism. But really the Puget Sound, if that's the body that we're trying to protect, all these fingers that go into Puget Sound are nicked, they're cut, they're bruised, they're scraped, and Band-Aids are not working.
This lack of planning for the protection of the tributaries reveals a critical need for resource management and prioritization at the watershed scale. Often these vital upland wetland systems are invisible to the public, making citizen advocacy less likely. Even when the intimate connection between land use and water resources is obvious, as is the case in river floodplains, the public doesn't always respond in favor of protecting watershed functions.
Floodplain management is an overarching policy of when are you going to build a levee to protect somebody, or when are you going to regulate floodplains so new development doesn't go into it. That's a very big policy choice, both for the county and for the cities. Although the county discourages reliance on levees to protect people, because we know levees eventually always will overtop, there are some places like the very urban port area where we simply have no choice. Those levees must be improved, and we need to try to keep the port, I-5, several railroads, and everything else, all this public infrastructure protected during the flood events.
It just takes a lot of money. And when we talk about environment, there are a lot of reasons to keep natural riparian areas and keep a river somewhat natural. But from a risk standpoint, there are really tremendous values in kind of letting that river kind of be natural, because that which we degrade, we have to pay for.
One of the things the county has been doing is an active floodplain acquisition program, where we are looking at the costs and benefit of protecting various properties. And when it costs several $1 million to build a single mile of levee, suddenly it starts making a lot of sense simply to get people out of harm's way. So over the last 10 or so years, the county has bought several hundred acres of floodplain property along the Puyallup River, which has gotten people out of harm's way. They've moved on, hopefully bought properties that aren't flood prone anymore, and it has saved us dramatically on the cost of having to maintain levee systems in those areas.
We have an area on the Puyallup that floods. They had a flood in '96 and then they had a flood in 2006. And it's a retirement place for senior citizens. And this year they lost 5 or 6 homes that had to be replaced, and then another dozen that had to be repaired. And that was after 10 years ago they had several, about a dozen or more homes that were raised 3 feet.
If you look at risk as a function of the frequency of an event times consequence, a levee really doesn't reduce the risk. What a levee does, it kind of weighs frequency with consequence. So instead of getting flooded a little bit all the time, you get flooded less. But when you get flooded, the consequence is huge. If the more development occurs, like what's now occurring in Undone, you have more runoff. And if there is less snow, and it's not an if, we know that's happening, so you'll have all of this water rush down at once. It won't be stored up there. These levees, if they are built perfectly to today's standards, in 25, 30 years, they will be not at any acceptable standard. And so then we have to go up.
Last year, just literally days before the November 2006 storms hit, the county completed the construction of a setback levee in the Undone area. The idea here was take an existing levee that had a low level of service, move it back further away from the river, and build a new levee with a 100-year level of service. And in doing so, we opened up about 66 acres of additional floodplain for the river to naturally migrate through, for it to be used as salmon habitat, etc. And that project is credited with probably saving the city of Undone from considerably more flooding than they saw. It's a great project, and it's sort of a model of what we would like to do. It's a good example of floodplain management, moving the levees back, letting the river become a more natural system, and keeping people out of harm's way.
Initially, the property owners wanted nothing to do with it, but the 1996 flood event made them believers. They said, we'll take your money and we want out. And as a result, today we have open space. We have a channel condition that more closely resembles its historical path as far as sinuosity, the number of pools, the amount of large woody debris. The whole concept of setback levees is well received by the tribe. We know we're never going to remove all the development, nor are we asking for that. But here's a way of basically meeting development and the needs of fisheries and natural resource protection, meeting them in the middle and providing benefits to both.
The lack of a consistent and enforceable water management process at the watershed scale has exacerbated flooding and conversely drought conditions in the Lower Puyallup River watershed. Decisions in upstream communities directly impact downstream communities, and yet current water management policies and regulations are limited in their ability to cross jurisdictional boundaries to bring about collaborative water management. This need to connect upstream and downstream jurisdictions for water quantity management is also necessary for addressing water quality concerns in the Puyallup River watershed.
We're also very interested in what's happening upstream, because what happens up there affects us. If we want to have an outfall for a sewage treatment plant, if we want to expand the plant, what somebody did upstream can stop us from doing what we need to do.
Like most tribes, we're at the mouth of a system, but unlike most tribes in the state, we're in a very urban system. We have 13 municipal wastewater discharges within the basin. We have about 32 major industrial wastewater discharges. This is freshwater dischargers that we receive the goodies to. So we're trying to effectively manage that through the water quality standards, if you will. So what we're having is lower summer flows and higher winter flows in effect. And the interrelationship is we have lower dissolved oxygen, higher temperatures with the lower summer base flows, and then the November
flood came, so all of a sudden we have these incredible peak discharge events that are really ephemeral in nature, but with that comes huge pollution loads within the system. So you see spikes of a variety of different contaminants, metals, fish killers like copper, dissolved copper, zinc.
Salmon are often credited with being an indicator species. Their presence or absence in any watershed is often indicative of some of the background conditions that exist there, whether it be mining, overall development, sewage discharge, timber harvest, the amount or square footage of impervious surface area in a watershed. They all affect salmon in a variety of different ways.
To locate, prioritize, and mitigate water quality problems in the Puyallup River watershed, the Clean Water Act mandates that state and tribal scientists establish the level of pollution that a water body can handle without impairing its function. This is known as the Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL process.
The way a TMDL happens is a water body gets listed on what is called a 303D list. The White River is listed for pH. We have some issues with dissolved oxygen, but I would say the two major ones are fecal coliform and temperature. We see that one in every single water body. Once it reaches the 303D list, then it is our job as Department of Ecology to go in and make a cleanup plan, TMDL, for that water body. We go out and work with communities, cities, counties, tribes, local citizens to come up with what kind of actions we can do to make those things happen.
A large percentage of it is non-point. The last statistics I saw kind of on an aggregate basis, it was pretty much 40-60. 40 point, 60 non-point. We do better by and large on addressing point source discharges, but it's the non-point contributions that are really impairing the system.
A great number of challenges remain in addressing water quality problems at the watershed scale. The process to create TMDLs requires a lot of work for each listed water body. State agencies are underfunded, and those regulated often do not follow permit requirements willingly.
In 1996, Washington and EPA were sued because we weren't doing them fast enough. And so we had I believe it was 13, it might be 15-year plan where we had to get 666 TMDLs done. We're finding that it takes a lot longer to do them than they thought, and so that's getting renegotiated, but we're really under the gun to get them cranked out. Some of the ones that have taken the longest, that's the issue, is they fight over the science that has been put out there.
You know, it's interesting because we discharge 1 billion gallons of wastewater on an annual basis into freshwater systems that ultimately get into the Sound. 1 million pounds of chemicals a year, yet there's not one municipal stormwater permit that isn't under appeal right now. And I don't mean to point fingers at anyone, it's just across the board, and we're in a very litigious society because it's cheaper as opposed to really doing the right thing.
I think that there are 4 categories, I guess, as I see it, with respect to this type of thing. One is education and voluntary implementation. A second is kind of goes along with that, but is providing a real technical assistance function to help advance those publicly implemented or volunteer implemented things. And then there are incentives and disincentives that people can bring into play in order to give perhaps some tax relief. Finally, there is the regulatory piece, but it's always kind of a combination of carrot and stick.
The city of Tacoma is often held up our source control program, which is the guys that are on the ground out in the watershed visiting the businesses, and when they see something happening that's not supposed to, they go and they educate the person. And I would say 90 plus times out of 100, that takes care of it. But that's not the only thing we're doing. We built a parking lot out at our landfill, which was a particularly unique area where we could install different sorts of pervious pavement. So we'll be able to put some quantitative numbers to
hopefully at some point incorporate rate incentives in our stormwater rates to encourage people to install these kinds of things.
Along South Prairie Creek, state and county agencies and nonprofit conservation groups are trying a new approach to address non-point source pollution from farming in the Puyallup River watershed. The demonstration farm they are creating aims to tie sustainable agricultural practices to habitat restoration and water quality improvement.
South Prairie Creek it's gone through all the stages. We just had our first adaptive management meeting, and we're actually meeting standards in the main stem, but we're getting hits in the tribs. Unfortunately, in that area, the conservation districts had some tough time working with some of the homeowners, so they just don't want to participate. So we're coming up with some innovative ways to maybe get them at the table, just to get them to listen.
Having a demonstration farm in association with salmon protection, I think, gives us a kind of double advantage there. There's a certain resistance in the agricultural community to making the stream salmon safe because it does take up part of their property to put the buffers along the streams.
One of the common challenges of establishing a riparian, what's called a riparian buffer zone, which is a vegetated area along a water body, is the amount of available room. Vegetation along a stream or river provides a number of very important functions. Among other things, it provides shade to keep the water temperatures cool. Much of aquatic life in the Puget Sound region depends on cool water temperatures in order to survive. When there's no shade, especially in the summertime, those waters warm up very quickly, depletes the amount of oxygen available in the water. Vegetation also acts as a filter. So surface water runoff may have various kinds of pollutants in it, whether it's oils or sediment or something else that is running off the surface of the land. The vegetation acts as a filter. Some say a buffer should be 200 feet wide, and on many properties, especially privately owned properties, there just simply isn't that amount of space. Frankly, I think that any buffer is valuable. We work with landowners to establish plants along their water body that they're comfortable with.
That's what the conservation district does historically, is demonstrate, help, and install best management practices on farms. Those are the kinds of things the conservation district does, and mixing the two of them, mixing the best management practices for farming with salmon recovery seems like a good deal.
Thus, state, county, and city water agencies are using a broad array of policy tools to address water quality problems in the Puyallup River watershed, although progress has been slow and pressure on these water resources continues to increase. Water quantity and water quality are tied to changing land use as development continues in the face of a growing Puget Sound population. It should come as no surprise, then, that development pressures also decrease available aquatic habitat. Sustainable development is a critical concept for incorporation at the watershed scale.
We're really lucky in the Port of Tacoma because the population is generally very, very supportive. Port creates a tremendous number of jobs. People see that and appreciate it. It gives us license to conduct our business and expand, but only so long as we do that with some credibility and some sensitivity to what we do. So we're constantly paying attention, whether it be traffic, trucks coming in and out of port property, congestion, air quality, water quality, global warming, all of those issues.
As part of that process, the port assesses what impacts development has on the natural environment. We, with our consultants and the regulatory agencies, go through an iterative process and establish a mitigation package that offsets the adverse modifications that result from the development actions. If we want to really make a good effort at recovering salmonids within the Puyallup River system watershed, we have to be proactive. And we have to go out and target properties that maximize the benefit to the salmonid life cycles. Prior to the levee system, there was a significant number of opportunities for juveniles to reside and to take refuge, gain sustenance, and develop. When the levees were established, essentially precluded any opportunities. So when juveniles would hit the Puyallup River, it would essentially just be shot out. So a pretty low success in terms of them being able to transition from a freshwater to a marine environment. This is the Clear Creek Phase 1 site. It was constructed back in the late 80s as part of the remediation or cleanup of the Sitcomb and Blair waterways. It's directly connected to the Puyallup River, tidally influenced. And this site's unique because it offers a myriad of habitats. The Port's very proud of it. We've completed our monitoring as part of the cleanup action. It's reached a high functioning value. It's also utilized by Chinook salmon. We also have a site on the lower end of the Puyallup River. It's called the Goglahide mitigation site. That project will yield approximately 6.2 acres of off-channel, estuarine, tidally influenced habitat that will also have a salt marsh and an upland wetland component to it.
There are a lot of challenges to doing restoration mitigation projects in an urban area, and neighbors are the major one. There's a lot of people that own property that have ongoing business concerns, and it would just be cost prohibitive to relocate them so that you can buy their property and convert it into mitigation sites. So the opportunities are limited just by virtue of the sort of the land value. There are some people who think that restoration projects in the estuary, which is essentially where we're at, where the Puyallup River meets Commencement Bay, are too expensive because of it's such an urbanized area and the property has higher and more economically viable uses that drives up the cost of the land and the cost of the restoration. You'd be better off going upstream. And there's some logic behind that approach. However, species like salmon that sort of integrate the effects of habitat throughout the watershed, if you just write off the estuary, then it's not going to be a functioning system. All the other work that you would do upstream could be for naught if you don't include projects like this.
Unfortunately, if you take that statement about best use of our money to its semi-logical conclusion, then all of your money gets spent upstream where land is cheapest and the problems are the least. It's a trite cliche anymore, but we do want to accommodate both people and salmon, so I think anything that we can do to demonstrate compatibility there is going to be beneficial.
Certainly development and the expansion of impervious surfaces of roads and rooftops is far more injurious to habitat than logging. Much of the impacts of logging, I believe, can be mitigated if they're done correctly. Whereas a lot of development associated with urbanization, I don't know that it can be mitigated entirely. I just don't know. I'm hopeful that we'll find the science to do so, but at the present date, we certainly have not achieved that.
When we look at the lower watershed, we see that encroachment onto the historic conditions. And when you try to imagine the extent of this river migrating across this lower floodplain, you can see from old aerial photos or even modern ones, the trace elements of these habitats that have been disconnected. And when we want to restore, when we want to begin to piece this together, it's important to understand that the animals that were part of this historic productivity utilize these habitats which have been cut off. Some species will migrate out quickly after their emergence from the gravel, but some species such as the coho and Chinook, which have a longer association with freshwater, will utilize these habitats as they transform go through their smolt phase. These are critical habitats.
One of the exciting developments going on right now is the acquisition of these stream corridor properties through the Salmon Recovery Funding Board. That's been kind of the initiating process to get the seed money. It was initially met with some hesitation by folks in the valley, but now the idea of selling out for conservation needs and perpetuating open space is more favorably received by the local population. That's key to not only this future of this property, but expanding that effort.
The property where we're standing is the site of the former England dairy farm. Because it was a dairy farm, there were large nutrient loads that had to be managed in an environmentally appropriate way. It's difficult to do that. You need to have a lot of land in order to take care of all the waste produced by the cows and whatnot. Several years ago, the dairy here decided to close. They moved their operation elsewhere. The land became available, and when word got out, a lot of people did not want to see this become another urban residential development. And because it is on South Prairie Creek, which is considered by many to be the premier stream in the Puyallup River watershed, an effort was made to protect this property. So through a number of different partnerships and cooperative agreements, this 100-acre parcel was purchased and is in ownership of the Conservation District. It's managed by the Conservation District.
Another important method for protecting water resources in the Puyallup River watershed is the conservation of agricultural lands through the purchase and transfer of development rights rather than the outright purchase of property.
I recently heard this conservationist speak at a lecture, and I really liked what he said. He said, random acts of kindness are great, but random acts of conservation is not good enough. And we think, agricultural land is really important to aquifer recharge, water quality, and obviously a food supply close to an urban fringe. We don't want to buy the underlying fee of the property because we don't want to own the land. I'm not a farmer, I don't know the first thing about farming, but I do know how to appraise a landowner's property. I do know that a landowner's development value on their farm is really important to them. That's their kids' college education fund, it's their retirement fund. So on a 100-acre farm, you can have 10 houses, or you could keep farming and get paid for those 10 houses without ever putting the 10 houses there. So we come in, write a check, and extinguish the development rights forevermore. That money goes into the pocket of the farmer, and they're incentivized forevermore to keep farming. And that what we call conservation easement or agricultural easement stays riding on the deed or title of the property forever. So forever it has to be a farm, it can't be a strip mall or a housing development. This concept of transfer of development rights says that we will, instead of outright me just writing you a check as a landowner and extinguishing your development rights, why don't we use the marketplace to lift those development rights off your farm or forest land, lift those development rights and place them somewhere that's more appropriate for development, like downtown Tacoma or some other urbanizing area. So instead of you and I as taxpayers paying for the conservation through our tax dollars, it's a developer who gets benefit from going denser on their project paying for the conservation. So everyone's incentivized.
The transfer of development rights, I think, has its place, but I think that concept needs to be linked to like regional mitigation banking, the concepts where money is pooled from not only individual developers but state HOV lane expansion projects, for example, where there's a large infusion of money that collectively binds up and buys the biggest chunk of property possible. You've got to get large chunks of property to be effective in this game. It's not easy.
Addressing water quantity, water quality, and habitat issues in the Puyallup River watershed requires integrated assessment, planning, and action at the watershed scale. Unfortunately, the patchwork of state and federal laws are applied differentially in many jurisdictions in the watershed. With a large array of governmental entities responding to environmental challenges within their own jurisdictional boundaries, a concerted and coordinated watershed management effort is difficult to achieve.
The Puyallup River flows through a large number of jurisdictions from the headwaters down to Commencement Bay, and Pierce County only directly regulates the unincorporated parts of the watershed, which means there has to be a lot of coordination between the jurisdictions in Pierce County. We do have different standards. Development is regulated differently in different areas, both from where they can develop and how they can develop, and that has caused problems in the past.
Talking about the watershed plan is like saying, here's the world, what are we going to do? And there are all these governments involved in it. And each of them has a concern in the watershed.
Well, I do believe that we actually need to look at things on a landscape basis. And I think to do that, it really does come down to interpersonal relationships between parties and organizations, because even though the opportunity has been there or is there, it really comes down to trust and trusting one another. And I think the longer I'm in this job, the more I've come to realize that things just don't get done when you have parties that, it's not just sometimes the antagonistic goals are easier to address if you have trusting parties, because then you can pretty much talk about anything and you can overcome that and come to a compromise. But when you don't trust the parties, you're not going to sit down to the table to actually come together in the first place.
The effort to build trust and coordinate watershed management efforts across jurisdictions thus far has fallen largely to the Puyallup River Watershed Council as the only group with a mandate to address water management issues at the watershed scale.
The Watershed Council does try to provide that forum. The Puyallup River Watershed Council tries to provide a forum where people can bring their concerns and give a little more voice to the concerns and the needs they have for their watershed issues. I think that there is a lot of mistrust among various elements here, and I think that we need to start listening to each other and understanding, which I think is what the educational process is about. But I got to admit, this process is, for the Watershed Council, is still in its infancy.
Well, in one sense, the council doesn't really have a lot of authority. They have no ability to create regulations. They can influence perhaps the creation of those regulations by local and state governments. They have no ability to enforce regulations, but they can raise awareness about that issue to those entities that do have that authority. The power of the watershed councils, I think, comes from public education and outreach, of bringing partners together, of working collaboratively on implementing projects.
The Puyallup River Watershed Council is aided in its advocacy work by a myriad of activists with more localized interests in the watershed.
Early on, Tacoma, the city of Tacoma realized that keeping them at the table as you develop your project just leads to much more successful projects, because if they have concerns, if they have comments, it's infinitely simpler and cheaper and more effective to hear them early on, so you can just sort of incorporate the response to them, and then everybody's happy at the end.
If there's a steward or some person with the appropriate personality to take on a stewardship role and kind of lead that charge, more power to them. The tribe tries to get behind them. The single unifying force is that they have one person who's dedicated to preserving that and makes it their life. And that's really what it takes. It takes that unique personality to stand up for a long time, take the drubbing of the public, take the various disinterested parties, and see that incremental improvements are made.
Now that I'm retired, I'm causing havoc in the neighborhood. I have been told that this is the only known native pond or body of water that the Washington Department of Fisheries and Wildlife are aware of that still has the western pond turtle living in it. The pond is a tiny little speck on the Puyallup city map within the Maplewood Springs map area, and so people just are not aware that it's here, and that's one reason that it has been able to remain this pristine. I know that they're not protected, and so I'm feeling rather desperate and in kind of a squeezed position, because I know the criticalness of this pond turtle, and that it isn't protected right now. The city is not giving a response to even their own municipal codes that are following the WAC laws. A project like this is overwhelming, and there are times when I become very frustrated and depressed and think, you know, I'm fighting City Hall, and so I take a break from it and recoup, and then, you know, go at it again. I'm determined not to let those things block my effort in trying to do as much as I can.
Unfortunately, it has become increasingly clear that greater coordination is needed with concomitant resources and regulatory authority at the watershed scale to address the issues plaguing the Puyallup River.
People are parochial, and their institutions are parochial. And the people that man those institutions are parochial.
I mean, you can write a plan and say, okay, now, A should do this, and B should do that, and C should do this. There's really nobody running around looking to see if A did what he was supposed to do, and B did what she was supposed to do, and C did what they were supposed to do.
We have a brand new group called the Puget Sound Partnership, which just got approved by the legislature this last legislative session. And in this biennium, there are about $235 million worth of funding that is going to go to help support salmon recovery, stormwater management programs, low impact development, retrofitting of septic systems, looking at shellfish, growing areas within Puget Sound, and also doing a fairly extensive media and public outreach campaign over the next 2 years. So there's a lot of money available that can support the implementation of these different programs focused on water quality and salmon recovery in particular. And so there's going to be a big push on water quality in this watershed.
I was hoping that the Puget Sound Partnership would be that kind of group that would involve the people who live where they think there's a problem, and would provide help for them to first understand the problem, then understand what needs to be done, and then find the resources to get that job done. I think the most effective way that the state works with cities is when they send out somebody who has a directive to get involved and to help the people, the locals, get it together.
Whatever form it takes, success in the long run will require greater collaboration among the tribes, city, county, state and federal scientists and administrators, watershed activists, and concerned citizens. This is a critical time for moving forward toward a solution, as new challenges are now being added to the list.
Most of us, when we talk about the future and we look at the things that concern us in the future here in Puget Sound, it usually comes back to two main things, and that is population growth and climate change.
Even a few degrees of global warming will change how much water is falling as snowpack during the year. We forecast that we will see much more wintertime flooding as more precipitation falls as rain, and probably much lower flows in the summer because we just simply don't have the snowpack.
Again, if the USGS and their findings are correct and that summer-based flows are continuing to diminish, then what was previously sporadic blockages are going to be more consistent in their nature and have a more overwhelming effect on the overall Chinook population.
Now, if global warming were even to raise the elevation of the water 2 feet, that would fundamentally alter the value and the function of a lot of these projects. And not to mention, given that the tide flats is the economic engine, you know, there's a lot of real estate that would be at risk as well. Depending upon the effect of the rising of the water, it could be huge.
Even with all the challenges of dealing with water quantity, water quality, and habitat issues in the Puyallup River watershed, advocates continue to maintain a positive outlook for the future.
In 2005, we had a record escapement of pinks to South Prairie Creek and the Puyallup watershed. We had an estimated 500,000 pinks in South Prairie Creek alone, and because we had a fairly mild winter, we anticipated very good survival. And based on what we've seen as far as numbers moving up the watershed right now, as well as that the Buckley trap on the White I think those expectations are going to be realized. We could see 500,000 to 1 million fish in the Puyallup this year. So it'll be a tremendous boon as far as nutrient loading to the watershed.
We all expect to have clean water that we can enjoy. And if we don't work to help make that happen and to protect it, then we only have ourselves to blame.
Writing something off is exactly the wrong attitude. That's exactly what's been going on for the last 100 years. That's exactly the reason that we are in the position we are in right now. We aren't going to write it off.
If we set aside certain areas for the river and certain areas for fish habitat, there's no reason why we can't have both floodplains and healthy salmon populations, as well as human developments. We really just need to give back about 2% of the land area to the rivers and fish. And that doesn't seem like too much to ask for. We just need to do it differently than we did it in the last century.
The water management issues being faced in the Puyallup River Basin in many ways typify issues being faced across the region, the state, and the country. The size and interconnected nature of a watershed means that previously unconnected political, environmental, and economic stakeholders must work together to manage the water they share. It is obvious to those involved in water management that addressing the need for a sustainable water supply for humans and salmon is intimately tied to improving water quality, decreasing flood risks, and expanding aquatic habitat. Moreover, mechanisms are already being proposed and tested in the Puyallup watershed that hold the promise of minimizing the impact of urban development on local water resources. However, without public support, the political will to fully implement these solutions is unlikely to materialize. Therefore, the critical component for sustainable water management in the future is comprehensive public education and outreach. There is no quick fix for the problems plaguing the Puyallup River watershed, and addressing these problems will require public support from a knowledgeable population and a coordinated, cooperative effort led by scientists and policymakers from all responsible entities. With a sustainable water management plan in place, we can face the future with hope.